is there? Okay, great. Thank you, Peter, and everybody involved at CRECS. I'm happy to be presenting to this group. I know most of you, so I'm really looking forward to an engaging discussion at the end. This is work in progress, so I'm actually presenting findings for the first time to an audience. So this is really exciting for me, and it's a project that's been really close to my heart also because the intervention was implemented in the middle of COVID and with school closures and a lot of chaos. So there's a lot that we've learned from the actual intervention, but also the process of doing something of this scale during school closures. So this presentation is about the effect of teacher expectations on student outcomes, and it's a randomized control trial in schools in Pakistan. This is joint work with my dear friends and co-authors Ronak Jain and Vatsal Khandelwal. Sorry, my slide is stuck. One sec. Okay, so evidence on the effect of teacher expectations on student outcomes is not old. In psychology, the effect of teacher expectations on student outcomes is broadly understood in this idea of Pygmalion effects, which is that if teachers communicate expectations of high performance and effort to students, it creates self-fulfilling prophecies, and teachers and the students then end up exerting more effort, and eventually their student outcomes improve. So that's kind of what motivated this study. And in settings such as Pakistan, where teachers are held in high regard, it is especially true that their expectations can matter in improving student performance. So for example, just as a snapshot, we found in a baseline survey of students that 65% of the teachers in our sample, they rank their own encouragement to students as being more important for improving student performance compared to the motivation that they may get from parents or friends. And similarly, we surveyed parents and found that 84% of the parents thought that if teachers conveyed and set an expectation of performance and effort for their child, that would benefit the child and improve their student outcomes. So in contexts such as Pakistan, there have been other studies. So I've cited two here. One is in Pakistan and one is in Colombia. It is possible that, let alone expectations, students sometimes may not even have information about their own performance. So broadly, we talk about giving expectations and understanding their impact on student performance. There is an information constraint that could possibly be playing a role in these contexts and settings as well. And second, lastly, or additionally, we also know very little about how these expectations interact within the classroom. So if one student is receiving certain expectations from a teacher, there is some evidence, but not conclusive, on how peer effects or friendships within the classroom could mediate the impact of those expectations. So under the framework of this literature, we ask the following big research question. So how do students' academic achievement and non-cognitive outcomes respond to high expectations of their teachers? And we try to explain this big question through three sub-questions. So does this depend on the framing and the level of teacher expectations? Can peer effects strengthen the effect of teacher expectations? And how do these effects of teacher expectation compare to the effect of just simply giving information about current performance to students? So our paper right now, based on what we've learned, we think it contributes to the literature and general discourse and policy on these two main fronts. One is that we experimentally evaluate the impact of communicating high teacher expectations. So the literature on Pygmalion effects that I mentioned before, that acknowledges the limitation of studying expectations because they're endogenous. People are continuously updating their expectations. The expectations are intrinsic. They may not be explicitly communicated, and it's hard to causally evaluate the effect of what somebody expects you to do on your eventual achievement. And the second contribution is that we try to understand this through a very simple, sustained, contextualized, and easy to implement method, which is also very low cost, to motivate student achievement in developing country contexts. So the literature in development economics and economics of education that I'm most familiar with, that has usually historically looked at incentive-based programs in trying to motivate or improve student achievement. And what we are offering is a very light touch intervention and trying to see whether that improves student achievement. In the broader literature on goal setting and teacher expectations, the evidence is not very conclusive. So we know that if students are setting their goals themselves, that does improve their non-cognitive outcomes. So there's evidence on great growth mindset in high-income countries especially, but we know very little about how if teachers are setting goals for the students and how they're setting those goals, how that influences their outcomes, that's still very inconclusive evidence. And lastly, we also tried to look at the literature on charter schools in the US because teacher expectations is a major component of those expectations. And we found that like programs and policies are focusing on broader things, and expectations is just one component of it, and very few studies have tried to tease out the impact of these expectations within these broader programs that have expectations as a component. So I think our work also speaks to that literature a little bit, and trying to understand a specific standalone component of educational programs. So the context that we operate in, we partnered with a large private school chain in Pakistan, which caters to middle and upper middle income families. We implemented this intervention remotely in 288 classrooms in 15 schools with 131 math teachers. So we only work with math teachers. And like I said before, we implemented the study at a time of limited in-person student interactions with teachers and with each other. Everything was remote. They were all operating through Google Classrooms. And these are some statistics about how teachers reported that students had not been very interactive or motivated in the last term when we did a baseline survey. Absenteeism was really high. Teachers were giving warnings for low attendance. Students were not necessarily completing their homework. So this is, like I keep stressing, it's important to understand this backdrop in which we did this intervention, which also unintentionally served as a motivation for the study, doing something low cost to improve their engagement, to improve outcomes. So this is just a simple overview of the sample. 41% of our sample is girls, 84% of the sample they speak Urdu as their first language at home. And these are some of the baseline indicators that we collected. So students on average are working 2 to 4 hours on their math in a given week. They are they all want to get better at maths. 95% of the students say they want to get better at maths. 74% of them say that they feel motivated by their peers. So in a sense, this slide is just to give you a snapshot of what the sample looks like and who we're working with in this intervention. So research design. The first thing that we did was we tried to elicit teacher expectations. We did that by reminding the math teachers, the 131 teachers that we worked with, of the latest score of every student in the class, and then asked them to fill out the following 2 statements. So now the teachers have this Excel file, which has the student scores from every student in their class. And we're asking them, based on that score, please tell us that how much do you expect the student to achieve? So the first statement is that you can consider something called a lower bound. So essentially, we're asking the teachers to report how much do they expect the student to at least achieve in the classroom. And the other one you can consider as an upper bound, where the teacher is giving a very high expectation that even this is achievable. So we ask, broadly teachers to give us these 2 numbers about what they expect the student to achieve. And then teachers were also guided that they should think of this as a realistic expectation, taking into account, the student's most recent test score. So what do these expectations look like? And I'm happy to talk about these later at the end of the presentation if we have time. But what we wanted to ensure was that there were no systematic differences in certain characteristics that teachers could potentially have a bias in, or stereotypes in based on, the local contextual factors or what the literature has suggested. So we reminded the teachers of the recent math scores so that we could ameliorate some of these biases. So we minimized the risk of gender and wealth-related stereotypes. And also, on average, we found that the gap in what teachers expected and the students' performance was highest for students in the bottom 25% of the distribution. So essentially trying to understand that, yes, teachers do expect the students to improve. It's not like the teachers are just blanketly saying everybody can achieve 100%. It's the lowest performing students that they would give a higher expectation to versus the others. And, happy to talk about this more at the end if we have time. So we adopted, this is a randomized control trial. So we adopted a clustered randomization design at the classroom level with 1,600 students. So we started with 288 classrooms and divided them into 3 equal groups. And the first group is the control group. The second I'm calling the individual, and I'll describe what the group is in 1 or 2 slides. And then a peer treatment group, which is the third group. And within these groups, because like I described, it's a cluster design, the control classrooms were divided at the classroom level into 2 more classrooms, 2 more groups. 1 group of classrooms received no information and 1 group received just the score. So again, going back to our larger question, that it's possible that students are not even getting information about their score. So we also want to see what happens if you just give them information. So the control classrooms are divided into 2 groups. And the individual and the peer level, we randomly assign either the high expectation that we elicited from the teacher or the very high expectation to the students. So again, within the individual and the peer treatment groups, we're randomly dividing the students into 2 groups, one that receives high expectation or a lower bound of expectations, and one that receives a very high expectation or an upper bound of expectations from the teachers. This is the timeline for the intervention. We did the baseline in March to May of 2021 and also administered independent tests. May to June is when the intervention happened. The school has its high stakes exam in June 2021, which we look at which are our first round of outcomes. Then we sent reminders about the intervention, and then the second round of high stakes exams take place in December 2021, which is our second round of outcomes that we look at. So this is the timeline, and I'll keep coming back to this as I describe the results. So what is the actual intervention? So what we call the individual treatment arm, we emailed students their most recent score. So where you see there's this girl, she receives this image. I am here is her score, is the score on her latest math test. And on here, so I presented this once at one of the education organizations that I'm a part of, and somebody asked me if this was a flag for North Korea. And before somebody asks me this question over here, I want to clarify that it is not. So here, basically, we put the expectation from the teacher. It could have been the high or very high, depending on which group you were randomized to. And here on the staircase were some tips that the teachers had highlighted in the baseline survey that we did with them of how they think the students could achieve, could get from where they currently were to their actual expectation. And we made these images for boys and girls separately. It's a very gendered society, so it was important to do it this way. So this is what the intervention that the individual treatment arm received. In the peer treatment arm, we each student received the previous image, the image on the previous slide with their score and the teacher's expectation. And then we also jointly sent an email to students, to two students who they were randomly paired with, and sent them this image with an added line that said, we hope that you both will encourage each other. So trying to, again, very light touch, see that if students, receive an email about their own teachers, about the expectations about their own performance, and are paired with the student randomly of the same gender, does that influence how they work and the eventual outcomes, that is student achievement. And finally, the information arm is just a placebo image. The students get this image, which has their score, the most recent score in their math exam. And then there is another pure control group that absolutely gets no email from us. There is no communication with them. Similarly, so one round of interventions, then we look at midline outcomes, but we also send them intervention reminders. So we tweaked the images a little bit just to make it more interactive in the next round of reminders. And here I've just put in the images that we had for boys. Again, we update the students' performance from their midline tests because we were able to do that, and then put in the teacher's expectations and try to, again, send these reminders to students that you are here right now and your teacher expects you to achieve this particular score. For the peer treatment arm, similarly, they get the original expectation image, but also receive a joint email with another student about encouraging each other and performing well and working together to achieve what their teacher expects them to achieve. And similarly, the information arm is a simple image which has the performance on their midline assessments before the endline exam. So to study this, we compare, this is our regression specification, and we run this regression on pre-specified outcomes. So this trial is registered with the AER. We pre-specified all the outcomes that we will be looking at. So we're not mining for results, and try to compare each of these treatment arms with a pure control group. Standard errors are clustered at the unit of treatment, and we include strata fixed effects in this regression. So now moving on to the results, what do we find? So here I have plotted the regression coefficients and just the confidence intervals. So what you can see here is that students who were in the individual treatment arm, they score approximately 0.2 standard deviations higher than students who were in the pure control group. So that means expectations are working. In the midline, students in the treated group are scoring higher, and this is a statistically significant effect. In the peer treatment arm, it is a positive effect, but this is statistically insignificant, meaning that on average, if you're in the peer treatment arm, there's no effect on your math test scores at midline. However, we also see that in the information arm, there's also a 0.2 standard deviation positive effect compared to a pure control. And it seems like both the individual and the information arm are working equally well to improve student performance at midline. So at endline, after we've sent the reminders and the tests that happened in December, so we look at standardized test scores there, and we find that the effects of the individual arm persist. So it's about 0.18 standard deviations. Students who are in the individual arm are scoring 0.1 standard deviations higher than the pure control. No average effect on the peer treatment arm. But in the information arm, we find that the students who are in this arm are scoring about 0.11 standard deviations higher than the pure control, but this effect is statistically not significant. However, because the confidence interval is so large, we can't rule out that the individual and the information arm are different from each other. So overall, like suggesting that the individual and information arm, both the effects persist in the long run. So those were the average effects. Here we've just plotted the scores trajectory. So at baseline where you were, midline and end line. The line to look at here is this blue line, which is for the individual treatment arm, and perhaps look at the control line, which is this black line. So what this is suggesting here that the midline tests were conducted in June after a COVID wave. So there are on average COVID learning losses in each of these treatment arms, but the slope is actually the smallest for the individual treatment arm. And then the recovery after is the highest in this treatment arm compared to the, say, control group or the information or the peer group. So broadly, this is just descriptive evidence to suggest that the individual treatment arm actually is working. So we also looked at English scores, even though the intervention had nothing to do with English. We only worked with math teachers. The expectation provided was of English test scores, but we find that there is actually a positive spillover of the individual treatment arm on English scores as well. So students who were were given these individualized expectations about English were also putting or perhaps exerting more effort in their other subjects. So there's a positive spillover for English here. And similarly, we see something in information, though this effect is not statistically significant. But at end line, the second round, the results flipped. So here what we're seeing that over time, if you're perhaps given information and expectations about a particular subject, you may be substituting your effort from other subjects. So here we see that there is a negative significant effect, negative but statistically insignificant effect on English scores in the individual arm. And in the peer arm, which actually had no average effects, students are doing much worse on English. So there is evidence of negative spillovers in a different subject. So to summarize, so we're all on the same page before I move on to the next set of results. Communicating high teacher expectations increases student performance in the short and long term. But we also see that information about performance also leads to equivalent improvements in student performance. I've just reported average effects, but if there are people who are interested in distributional effects or quantile effects, I'm happy to talk about those at the end of the presentation as well. So we find suggestive evidence of effort substitution over time as English scores decrease for treated participants. We find no average effects on short and long-term math scores, as I've said. And I don't report these results here, but these are only high-stakes tests that the school administered. We also conducted tests independently, which were low stakes, and we find no effects on those tests. We also collected a bunch of non-cognitive outcomes based on our theoretical framework and our surveys. But unfortunately, what our biggest learning through this process is that it's really hard for people to make people do a survey when everything's in an online format. So there's limited power to detect an effect given the sample size that we have for those tests and survey outcomes. Okay, so I still haven't answered the three questions that we started with. Maybe the overall question is answered, but does the content and framing of teacher expectations matter? Then why does the peer arm not have average effects, given that the peer arm is actually an addition to the individual arm? So you're getting individual expectations, plus you're being asked to work with the peer. So what's happening there? And then why does information lead to large effects? I think that's one of the biggest puzzles that we're trying to understand here, that just getting simple information, how can that have such a big effect, as big as getting information plus expectations? So because we were able to randomize students into very high and high expectation groups, as when I was explaining the research design, I mentioned that what we find is that the results of the individual arm are actually driven by those students who received the very high expectation goal. So contrary to most of the evidence that I have come across, and I'm happy to be referred to other papers that we may have missed, it is said that if students are setting really high goals, there's something called frustrated aspirations that may kick in. They may just think that this goal is too far ahead for me to accomplish. But we are finding evidence to the contrary. We are finding that if the goals are realistic but very high compared to just a lower bound of expectations, that actually leads to a bigger effect in outcomes. And again, in both subjects, not just math, but in English as well at midline. At endline, again, we see 0.21 standard deviations for the very high group, which also suggests that the effect on math, at least, it persists. And in the very high group, again, while there is some negative spillover on English, it's statistically insignificant. So again, suggesting that very high expectations of students, they work. So what's happening in the peer? Why don't we see average effects? So here what we did is that we looked at what if the pair that you were matched with had the same score as you at baseline, had a lower score than you at baseline, or had a higher score than you at baseline. And what we find is that if you were paired with somebody who is of the same quote unquote ability, I use that term loosely, you're actually scoring really, really high. So 0.5 standard deviations. And even in English, remember there were negative spillover effects on English for the average effect. Even in English, if you're paired with somebody of the same ability, the effects are much, much higher for you as part of the treatment. So we do this for ability, we do this across wealth, we do this across measures of motivation, and we find that if you are paired with somebody who is similar across on all these different characteristics, and I think we also look at whether you're paired with somebody you identify as a friend, which we also think that like all of these things are indicators of being friends with the person, or could be proxy for being friends with the person, we find that the effects are larger. As opposed to if you're paired with somebody who's scoring much higher, who's very different from you on the wealth spectrum, who's very different from you in terms of baseline motivation, or is not your friend, you're actually scoring much lower. So this we found really exciting, that being paired with somebody who's similar to you actually has positive effects on your outcomes. In the end line, again, we don't necessarily see effects on English, but again, we see that all the negative effects on the spillovers that we were seeing initially are among students who are not paired with somebody who's similar to them. So again, it's worse for you if you're on other subjects as well, if you're paired with somebody who is academically stronger than you at baseline. So the third question about information. So what is happening with information? And here I think we don't have a clear story yet, but we're trying to figure it out. This is why we're presenting it at various different forums. So for the information arm, we spoke to the school that we worked with, and they said that there was variation in the schools in terms of parental literacy. So some of these schools are in more remote areas, some of these schools are in urban centers where parents are more savvy with technology and are able to access the online portal where the students' scores are uploaded. And here, while these results are statistically insignificant, what this is showing is that it's a negative effect. Actually, maybe I should show the next one. Okay, so this is a negative effect. So what this suggests to us is that if you're in a school where parents have a lower literacy level, the information arm works. It's because this might be the first time that they're actually looking at that information about the student performance. So broadly, we think that there is some variation based on the kind of school that you're in, but this is preliminary, and we're still trying to exploit what's essentially happening in the information arm. So to quickly summarize all these heterogeneity results, the first thing that I spoke about was that students respond well to realistic but ambitious goals communicated to them in the form of very high expectations, so high goal setting. In the peer treatment arm, we see significantly positive effects for those whose randomly matched pair is similar to them. And I mentioned it's based on ability, wealth, whether they're friends, and some measures of motivation. The effect of the information arm, though statistically insignificant, they persist in the long run, albeit only in schools with lower parental literacy. And we also do heterogeneity by these other factors, such as gender, younger or older cohorts, or baseline performance, and these were all pre-specified in our plan, and we don't find any heterogeneity across these different characteristics. So next steps. So we really want to understand what's happening. We've tried to exploit the data as much as we can. But I think the one overarching question that we want to understand now is that do students like how are they updating their beliefs about their ability in math after they receive this information about their performance and teachers' expectations? So we have planned some focus group sessions with teachers and students to just see how they're interpreting the treatment. So, giving them the images again and trying to having them talk through their thought process of what essentially are they thinking when they see these treatments being given to them. And as I said before, we're planning to use variation in school characteristics to better understand the effects of the information arm. So that's all from my end. I'd quickly like to thank a few people before I end. So one, very grateful to our partner schools for their collaboration. It was a really tough time during 2021 to have them while they were figuring out all the online education delivery structures, also facilitating our research. Thank you to our funders, RISE Pakistan and JPAL, the Jameel Poverty Action Lab at MIT. And really thankful to our research team, especially Amara and Umar, for their research assistance. We've also presented this at various seminars, LEAP, SLUMS, AEFP, Harvard, and Oxford, and we've gotten some really good feedback. If you have any comments, feedback, happy to talk the rest of the 20 minutes about them. But if not, if you'd like to share something over email, my email address is here, as are the email addresses of my co-authors, Ronak and Vatsal. Thank you.